Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. And here are the major points that I'm hoping to get across today. I'm going to begin with the evolution problem that everyone knows about, the miserable acceptance of evolution among the general public. Then I'm going to say a little bit about what I call higher education's evolution problem, which is not discussed quite so much. And then a problem which we all know about but don't connect to evolution usually, which is the fragmentation of knowledge, all of this information, and how do we put it together, how do we unify it. Then I'm going to talk about a solution to some of these problems and give a case study in the what I would call the ecology of altruism, and finally connect these to the topic of health, which of course is the topic of this symposium. So this talk is very much on the topic of this symposium, but it includes more as well. So here are the familiar facts. You don't have to be told about these, the dismal statistics about accepting evolution. It doesn't seem to matter how educated you are. Educational efforts often fail, and it gets worse. For me, the most depressing fact about acceptance of evolution is not that 50% of Americans don't believe in it, but that the other 50% who do believe in it do not connect it to matters of importance in their own lives. And for so many people who accept evolution, it's about dinosaurs and fossils and human origins, all of which is very interesting, but it is not about their own lives or the current human condition. There are no polls which estimate the fraction of people who actually connect evolutionary theory to matters of importance in their own lives. But if there was, it would be a minuscule fraction. And it gets worse. So I like to say that there's two walls of resistance to evolution. We can deny evolution altogether. But we can also accept evolution for the rest of life, but in one way or another deny its relevance to human affairs. And this wall of resistance has been alive and well within academia for most of the 20th century. So that's what I call higher education's evolution problem. Here's an example. This is the kind of intellectual tradition that we associate with postmodernism and social constructivism. You'll find this in literary studies departments and also in cultural anthropology departments. This is based on an article in 1997 by Barbara Ehrenreich and Janet McIntosh. This article begins, by the way, with the story of a social psychologist who attended a conference on emotions and tried to give a talk about emotions as something which might be in part biologically based, and she was shouted down at this conference. The result is an ideological outlook eerily similar to that of religious creationism. Like their fundamentalist Christian counterparts, the most extreme anti-biologists suggest that humans occupy a status utterly different from and clearly above that of all other living beings. And like the religious fundamentalists, the new academic creationists defend their stance as if all human dignity and all hope for the future were at stake. And I think many of you have experience with this kind of intellectual tradition. Well, it gets worse because it's not confined to the humanities and the tradition that we associate with postmodernism. It is very characteristic of the mainstream social sciences. So we're talking now about economics, political science, sociology. These folks are scientific in every sense of the word, but still have this problem with evolution. So this was written in 2005 by a political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania named Ian Lustig, and I think many of you will recognize this also. Of course, social scientists have no objection to applying evolutionary theory in the life sciences, biology, zoology, botany, etc. Nevertheless, the idea of applying evolutionary thinking to social science problems commonly evokes strong negative reactions. In effect, social scientists treat the life sciences as enclosed within a kind of impermeable wall. Inside the wall, evolutionary thinking is deemed capable of producing powerful and astonishing truths. Outside the wall, in the realm of human behavior, applications of evolutionary thinking are typically treated as irrelevant at best, usually as pernicious, wrong, and downright dangerous. And I think that this situation is very much connected to an even bigger problem, which is the fragmentation of knowledge. In my book, Evolution for Everyone, I say that the ivory tower would be more aptly named the ivory archipelago, many islands of thought, poorly connected to each other. And this is a huge difference, I think, between the biological sciences and the human-related subjects. Why is it so much fun to be a biologist, especially an evolutionary biologist? It's because you're using the same basic principles to study so many different topics and so many different organisms. In my own career, and I'm not at all special about this, I've studied all kinds of creatures, bugs, beetles, fish, birds, foraging, mating, speciation, community composition. And how is it possible in this age of too much knowledge for a single person to switch from subject to subject, organism from organism? It's because all of them are manifestations of just a few basic principles. And that's why the biological sciences are unified and the human-related subjects are not. If you're studying a human-related subject, if you're a psychologist, you have no particular reason to be an anthropologist or an economist or to learn about those subjects. If you're a social psychologist, you have no particular reason to know about cognitive psychology. If you're a social psychologist who studies Machiavellianism, you have no particular reason to go next door to a social psychologist who studies sociopathy, even though it turns out that those subjects are the same when some brave soul puts together the literatures. And so we have an almost infinite fractal progression of subjects that are not put together. So I think that, although it might sound extravagant, we're living in an important moment in intellectual history for reasons that are complex and which trace a lot to the last talk about the associations of evolution, and especially the political associations of evolution. Evolutionary theory was confined to biology and avoided for most human-related subjects for most of the 20th century. And so no matter how open-minded a current scientist is or scholar is in the human-related subjects, they're handicapped by the fact that their entire discipline is developed without reference to evolution. And this situation is now changing very fast, mostly within the last 10 or 15 years. Something I didn't put in this talk, but let me just mention it briefly. If you look at the journals, current scientific research, you will see that a very large proportion of articles are written from an evolutionary perspective. So this is now amply represented at the level of scientific research, but it is not represented yet, or only becoming to be represented, at the level of higher education. Okay, so it is still the case that it would be difficult if you're a student, a graduate student or an undergraduate student in a human-related subject. You can easily get your entire higher degree without any training in evolution. So now at the research level, virtually every human-related subject is being approached from an evolutionary perspective, even the humanities. How many of you read the lovely article in Science Times last Tuesday by Natalie Angier on how art got its start? Wonderful, wonderful topic. Okay, so what's the solution to all of these problems? I think there is a common solution to them, which is straightforward, really, in retrospect. Ideas are like anything else. So anything that's a threat, our impulse is to run away from it or to kill it. So the key for accepting any idea, no matter how well supported by factual evidence, is to make it unthreatening, explanatory, and useful. If an idea is threatening, and this is actually an evolutionary statement about the mind. It's like evolutionary epistemology, is that if an idea is threatening, most people are not going to accept it. But if you can make it unthreatening, explanatory, and useful, then it'll be hard not to accept it. And so if we're going to do this for evolutionary theory, this must be accomplished with respect to human affairs in addition to within the biological sciences. Of course, there's all sorts of implications of evolutionary theory within the biological sciences that are unthreatening, explanatory, and useful. And many of the talks that we've heard here today are of that kind. But we're not going to make these ideas fully unthreatening and explanatory and useful until we relate them to our own everyday lives, human affairs. And so once we do this, once we expand evolutionary theory beyond the biological sciences, then there can be the same unification of knowledge for humanity, for our understanding of humanity, that already has existed in the biological sciences. And it's so very interesting that we have, one of the things that's in the human-related subjects is a distrust, a skepticism of grand theories. They're called meta-narratives. And why is that? In part because so many have come and gone. But it's very interesting that in the biological sciences, we do have a proven grand theory. And I'm optimistic enough to think, with justification, that that's kind of unification can exist for human-related subjects. So what makes evolution threatening? Everyone sort of jumps to the conclusion that it's religion. And of course, it is in a sense. There is a conflict between specific religious beliefs and at least some specific religious beliefs and evolutionary theory. But there's two others that I think weigh much larger and are independent of religious belief. First is, what is the relationship between evolutionary theory and morality? From the very beginning, it seems that Darwin's theory can explain selfishness well and altruism poorly. And secondly, what is the relationship between evolution and human potential? Many people, religious and otherwise, cherish the thought that they can become better in the future and society can become better in the future, that there's a potential for change for the better. And if evolution seems to deny that, as the typical rendering of genetic determinism seems to indicate, that we're stuck with our genes, basically, and we cannot change over timescales, the timescales that matter, then that is tremendously threatening. So that we need to address both of these issues. And in this short talk, I'm only going to address one. Let's see how we can make evolutionary theory unthreatening, explanatory, and useful for the subject of morality. Well, here's how I teach it to my students. So I'm facing a class of college freshmen. They're fresh out of high school. Some know a little bit about evolution, others don't. And we play this little game where I ask them to list the traits that they associate with good and evil. How would you describe the morally perfect individual? And they love to do this. So, and you get the list that you'd expect. These are completely unsurprising. The good individual is altruistic, honest, love, sacrifice, bravery, loyalty, forgiveness. And evil is characterized by selfishness, deceit, hatred, avarice, cowardice, betrayal, spite. So now with these two types of individuals in mind, let's perform 3 thought experiments. What will happen if you put a good person and an evil person together on a desert island? Huh? What'd you say? We'll keep it simple and say the same sex. So what do you think my students say? You bet. A no-brainer. The good person will become shark food within days. There is something about the traits that we associate with goodness that seems inherently vulnerable to the traits that we associate with evil. There's a Ray Charles song which says, "She took advantage of my goodness and made a pitiful fool out of me." So that's the between-sex interaction right there. Second thought experiment. What will happen if you put a group of good people on one island and a group of evil people on another island? Okay, they'll get invaded, but if they're too far away, so they're totally isolated from each other.
People will get along and survive, and evil people will probably kill each other off.
Oh, you do easily as well as my students.